I dropped out of university and then I went to drama school. The original cast of Evita was my first proper equity job.
Not a bad one to start with, really,
yeah,
was it?
It was quite good. I understudied David Essex and I was in the chorus, the toy soldiers who dance up and down mechanically, and the miners and the police, all sorts of... I must have had to change my trousers over 6,000 times in the time I was there.
Were you surprised that you were immediately given a job in such a great show?
I was surprised, actually, because everybody else was coming to the audition with their sheet music and singing proper songs from musicals, and I wasn't that good a sight reader at the time, and I took my little acoustic guitar and just sang a sort of calypso because it was the only thing I knew how to do, not realising, of course, that that's what they needed for Che, was somebody who could play the guitar and sing a calypso. So I was sort of taken on board immediately and made to understudy David Essex. I'm the only actor, I think, in generations of more serious and sensible people.
So where did the comedy begin for you?
I suppose you could say at the Comedy Store. I had a show that I'd written with Peter Richardson, the comic strip producer and writer, and we had a double act, and we took it down the Comedy Store, which is where we met Rick Mayall, Adrian Edmondson, Alexei Sale, etc. And it sort of carried on from there. We went across and formed our own club, the Comic Strip, which then later ended up on Channel 4 as the Comic Strip Presents. And around that time, out of that comedy work, came the young ones.
And of course, at that time, you mentioned some of the names who've moved on to fame and fortune through comedy, but there were quite a lot of young, talented people. I suppose the Cambridge Footlights had been the sort of predecessor, but the Comic Strip and the Comedy Store really found all sorts of talented people. Ben Elton's another one, of course. That's
right. I mean, the as you say, the Cambridge Footlights, up until then, I think since the 60s, there'd been a sort of Oxbridge satire boom, and I suppose the Comic Strip and Comedy Store mark the demise of that, although it's still going strong. But I suppose we were the first bunch of comics since the post-war days of Hancock and Sellers and all that, who didn't come from Oxbridge.
And that's where the writing began as well, did it?
No, not really. I used to... I've always done co-writing. Even at school, I co-wrote comedy plays and things. And through the comedy, obviously co-writing comedy, and then I co-wrote some comedy books. But The Good Enough Dad, which you mentioned earlier, was the first thing I'd really written all on Metod. And that gave me the courage, I suppose, to think I could maybe branch out and write on my own.
Now, the casting of the young ones was inspired, but whose idea was the programme in the very first place, in the first instance? Who said, what about a group of students living together in a house?
It's always very difficult to say that. At the time, we were looking quite hard for a television vehicle, as they say, and we'd thought of a house in which each act from the club had their own room, and that idea was a bit unformed. But I think it was probably Rick Mayall and Lisa Mayer who coined the idea that they should be students in a house, and that Alexei was going to be the landlord.
And what about your character, Neil? Who came up with that?
Well, I was doing Neil in the show I wrote with Peter Richardson, and then on Boom Boom Out Go the Lights, which was a sort of precursor to the alternative comedy on television, and again in the Comedy Store and the Comic Strip. And then really with the script from Ben, the character that I had, which was just a little small part of the act, developed into the full-blown whinger that he ended up.
At book signings and so on, do people still come up and say, go on, do Neil for us?
Not just at book signings. In the pub and in the cafe, and yes.
Now, if you enjoyed this interview, please click on the like button, ring that notification bell so you don't miss out in the future, and if you possibly can, help the channel by subscribing. Thank you.